All right, welcome to podcast number 5. We're pretty stoked. We have not been canceled yet.
Not been canceled yet.
How awesome is that, hey?
Soon,
probably. Hey, so you know what we want to do today? Because I know everyone's sick of hearing about COVID. Is it COVID? COVID?
COVID, yeah.
We learned it was COVID.
Yeah. Well, it's an op-ed, so why wouldn't it be a COVID?
We want to talk about some of the lessons that we have learned. Now, the reason I think this is important, we'll get a little bit serious here and then we'll go back to the peanut gallery, is I think there is an issue in our culture that we are missing out on some of the lessons we learned in history, and we are just repeating those same cycles over and over again. We do that in our lives. Like, we don't even have to go back thousands of years, but you do that in your own life. You make the same mistake and you make it over again and over again. And looking back, and I think so this year of COVID, we've learned a lot.
Yeah.
We have learned a lot. We talked about this, and last time me and you were together, we talked about parenting. There's a lot we learned there. But the tendency of humans is kind of to forget.
Yeah, we definitely have that ability. It seems like the constant push to be reminded is something that we always need to keep in front of us, because we can very quickly get lost in, I think, where we want to head and not really understand that that is exactly the kind of lack of perspective that puts us in a place exactly where we had come from.
Right.
And I think that's definitely been an issue. I think we've seen a little bit of that starting to play out again in front of us in these days. Yeah. I think it's definitely, we need to be more involved. On many levels, right? Like on many levels, like not just more involved on a community level, but more involved, politically speaking.
Wow. So before we get into our top 5 that we want to talk about, I want to know from Trevor in the Peanut Gallery, what's the biggest thing that you have learned during this past year, COVID?
Wow, way to put me on the spot there, Mr. Albert. You're a real peanut. What was the question? What was it again?
What is the biggest lesson you have learned over this past year?
What is the biggest lesson I have learned? I've learned that it doesn't matter how much time you have on your hands. If you're going to do something, you're going to do it. Like, a lot of people before COVID would use, I don't have enough time to do this. I don't have enough time to do this hobby that I want to do or do this. And it's just a load of bull, really. Yeah.
So. A load of bull. I like it. It's good. 100%. When I have time, I'll work out.
How's that going for you? It went really good for me for about 6 months. And then, woo!
100%. No, that's a great point. Great perspective, TT. Patrick, what about you? Biggest thing when you look back at the year, kind of, I know there's a lot, but what would you say is one thing that stands out?
I think from an overarching kind of perspective is get involved. Get involved. Don't just be on the sidelines of life. Don't be a passenger in every car. Don't be a spectator at every sporting event. Actually, put yourself into something and get involved. I think we could change a lot of things if we would be willing to, participate in it rather than just spectate.
Well, and I think building off yours, I think one of my biggest ones has been watching so much unrest. We saw a lot in the U.S., but we've seen unrest all over the world. And I think one of my biggest lessons is watching everyone have answers for cities like Portland, but not bothering to look in their own neighborhood. And so we see people go, well, if Trump did this, or if Biden did this, or if Portland did this, or if Detroit did this, and you have all these answers for all these other areas. Meanwhile, nobody's looking at their own neighborhood. Nobody's looking at the issues here. And I think that's one of the things with social media, that we have all these massive problems that we're aware of, and somehow we stop focusing on our own small little part. Yeah. So what solutions do you bring to Malahide? What solutions do you bring to Elmer? How do we stop racism here? How do we stop prejudice here? How do we stop discrimination here? How do we stop that here? Because it's happening. Let's not kid ourselves. Even in areas where there's not multiple colors, this stuff happens.
Oh, yeah.
Humanity has an unbelievable creativity in the way they hate.
Yeah, there is definitely no lack.
Right.
We seem to only look at racism as being something that's a black or white issue.
Yep.
If we could use the two most spoken about colors in the spectrum of humanity.
Yeah.
But the reality is that there is all sorts of cultural racism that takes place, and it's discrimination that takes place. And I mean, it doesn't matter if it's black on black or white on white. It doesn't matter. It exists.
Yep.
And it's really, man, you said it right. We are definitely creative about how we apply that type of discrimination to each other.
Well, and I think, again, when we look at the bigger issues around us, it takes the pressure off of us to be good.
Yeah.
So we go, well, at least we're not like that.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, we're bullying the kid who's either too short or too tall or too skinny or too fat or too slow or too whatever you want to put in there. And this happens here. And so I think that to me has been a big thing for me myself. Because I love the news. I grew up in the news. And so we want to start with politics. That's where we're going to talk first off. But I grew up with a dad who we watched the news, but only until after the weather. And you guys won't know because you're all young little people that are listening. But if you were my age or older, you know that there's the news, there was the weather, and then there was all the stuff I cared about. So then sports and entertainment came after that. But then it was like, okay, now let's go eat supper. And so I grew up watching the news, watching politics, and so I love politics. But this last season of politics has been absolutely crazy.
I definitely think that we've had a very interesting last decade.
Yeah.
I would say of what of the direction that politics was heading and how that's impacted. I wouldn't necessarily say politics, but I think this has been a long trending kind of arc,
right,
when it comes to how people's spectrums of ideologies
Right.
and what they think and how they feel about it, and how it's actually, the further we've gone along this pathway, the more divided we've come, and you can see that how it plays out in politics, especially. Whether or not the most popular thing, whether you're left or right, or whether you're conservative or liberal, whether you're somewhere in between.
Yeah.
We don't know what the NDP is. Let's just be honest. Nobody's quite sure what they are.
But I feel the same.
They're either cheap liberals or they're off the wall conservative. We're not really sure.
We are getting canceled
I don't
today.
care. It's just good old Canada.
Listen, so I would also like to ask the question, what's the Christian Heritage Party? There's a Green Party. So let's actually, before we get into just heckling politics, let's get into what we want to talk about, because I think there's two problems. I think there's one is there has been, of those who are engaged, there's a very distant social media, uneducated engagement. So we throw the terms left and right around, but most of us don't actually have a clue. When you look at what it actually means fundamentally, most of us haven't researched it. We just make a lot of giant assumptions.
Yeah.
Well, if I'm, not a conservative, then I must agree with the liberals, and anyone who disagrees with me, then I just assume is a conservative.
Yeah, there is.
Did you look into any of this?
No, most people don't, and most people don't understand there is a huge spectrum. But that, again, like we said from the get-go, that requires conversation,
right?
And that requires you to actually spend the time to get to know the person you are having this discussion, disagreement, argument with. It's funny how we almost live in a culture now that the first thing you want to do is argue. The last thing you want is actually to have a conversation.
Right.
I just want to argue with you, because I want to be able to scream at you, because studies say, and psychology says, that the person who screams the loudest is the person who wins the argument.
Right.
And the reality is I think we're living in a time frame where there's been so much screaming, and there's been so much of that type of, not conversating with each other, but just screaming at each other, that we've all lost. Because there's been no dialogue,
right.
And I think we've lost some of our humanity by not having those discussions that we need to have.
Right. So in a system the way we operate, where we have in Canada at least, we have a couple parties you can nominate from. That's about it. Our issue is there's a ripple effect to this, because at the end of the day, the politicians want to be elected.
Right.
So they're going to go based on whatever platform the people themselves want.
Right.
And so our lack of education about what these politics actually stand for and who we vote and what we want has had a drastic effect, because they're just looking to please us. When you think about what Justin Trudeau got elected on, he got elected on not being conservative,
right,
and
great
hair, and weed. He was going to legalize weed. And when you look at a lot of that, but then you look at, I disagree with a lot of things he's done, but I also disagree with
let's be fair though. Justin Trudeau also got elected because he got elected based on a promise.
I think
that promise is that I promise to treat you as equal as I treat everybody else. I think that was an underlying narrative, and this idea that the young people can make a difference by engaging in bigger picture things, and that resonated. That resonated with a lot of young people, and I think that's another one of the reasons why he got elected.
Right.
I don't think there's.
All right. So
in terms of policy and in terms of actual things that he does, it's not very much dissimilar to the way any other political party would,
Right.
but it's the way he presented that, and he's kind of ridden on that. And actually, we've seen the way he conducts himself in terms of how he runs government and how he runs press conferences and how he controls the narrative and how he does it. He ticks the bill of other politicians that people on either side of the spectrum would really point to and dislike because of they would say there's something nefarious or controlling or but because of the image that he's tried to cast, he's not looked upon that way.
And so, sorry, just choking on
peanuts.
Joking up, yeah. Thank you for that.
I had
You're
some
welcome.
popcorn in between.
That's that bad of an answer, right?
It's killing me over
You don't
here.
need to be choked up about this kind
No,
of thing.
so it's such a huge topic, and I think that's why people tend to get away from politics, because very quickly we get offended too.
See, right away we
get-
jump to the national discussion.
Well, that's where most of us live, and I think we want to come back from that. But there is a piece of we need to understand what we're voting for. We need to understand what they're doing and what they're not. And I think those things matter. So I think engagement is a huge thing. And all these three levels we're going to talk about. But I think the biggest hindrance I have seen in the national level is that it's become an us versus them.
Yeah.
I am 100% conservative no matter what they stand for. But that's not true.
No.
There's a lot of things the Conservative Party does that I go, I don't stand for. There's some things that Liberals do that I totally agree with.
Mm-hmm.
Some things the NDP do that I agree with. So I think we've created this us versus them, and I think that's where a lot of the politics have just gotten useless, because we're not actually having dialogue, because if you disagree with me, I can just call you a liberal and somehow that's offensive.
Right.
Or you call me a conservative and somehow that's supposed to be offensive, and
Yeah.
it shouldn't be. We're trying to make Canada better, and there are different perspectives. And one of the things that we often don't think about with politics, and especially now when you're looking at the U.S. where they're talking about socialism versus
Capitalism.
capitalism, and all the different options in between, at the root of a lot of those conversations is the question, how do we help people out of poverty?
Yeah.
And their perspectives may totally disagree with what you're doing, but sometimes we miss that part where a lot of these conversations start well. We have a ton of people who are suffering. How do we help them suffer less? The conversation about universal health care, same thing. So for those of us who have health care, we live in Canada, our healthcare system isn't perfect, but as far as I'm concerned, it's pretty stinking awesome.
Yeah, the healthcare system is definitely good, but I think we need to add to that conversation as part of it. It definitely could use some work.
Yeah, but my point being more, the idea with these conversations, a lot of them, at the root core, you're trying to take care of each other.
Right.
How do we get the best medical care for Canadians? How do we get them for everybody? How do we get for those who can't afford?
Right.
And that's where a lot of it starts. But when we just constantly have this us versus them, I can't even hear the other side. Well, there is a perspective that comes from the other side that says, okay, well, capitalism is awesome, but there are people that are not able to get ahead.
Right.
What do we put in place? And so I think in this conversation about politics, sometimes we forget the people that we're actually talking about, but a lot of those dialogues are about those people. Right now, when you look in our little region, how do we have homelessness?
Right.
How in the world, in an area so rich and so well off, do we have homelessness? But we do. So both sides would say, well, we have the solution. Well, both of you have been in power, and neither of you have got the solution.
Right.
And so I think somewhere in between, we have to have this dialogue.
Yeah, we've talked about this exact problem. One of the greatest examples that we can use right now is that the Democratic Party in the United States has been in power in areas that African American communities would have the greatest population base since the 1960s. And their levels of poverty and the levels of problems have only amplified.
Right.
And yet they're seen as the answer.
Yep.
And we've seen a progression of things getting worse for them.
Right.
So and then when Republicans take over and they start promoting their agenda, it's just seen as people that are trying to get rich and people that are promoting corporations and people are.
Right.
And the reality is that on the ground, the people that are actually suffering and the people that are actually hurting, they're not getting any help.
Right.
They're not getting the help that they need. It's one thing to hand somebody a $20 bill, and think that's the solution,
Yeah.
but you don't know how that $20 is going to get spent and how that's going to positively impact that person's life, or if it's going to negatively impact them, because it does.
Right.
And people right away want to jump, well, you can't judge people that way, but you don't know the brokenness of the people that you're trying to help. Unless you're on the ground to be able to do that, and that's something that we've seen working with some different social services, is that you need to actually have some serious experience experience on the ground to know how to help people, the most vulnerable people, the most people that are the most struggling, out from that situation to at least a level where we as the rest of humanity can look at that situation and go, okay, we can feel good about that, but instead we just want to pile onto our side and we don't help anybody.
All right, so a couple things. First is we are never going to get on to 3, 4, and 5 because this conversation has gone off the rails and I love it. So we're just going to keep going here. But okay, so let's jump ahead with that concept, because when you go to LA, so we've been to LA, and you go to the areas that are absolutely poverty ridden, and you go, okay, well clearly the president cannot solve this.
Right.
The state legislature can't. So let's bring it back to Canada. It's the same concept. I mean, a lot of the American politics is so much in the news. It's the same thing when we look at some of the reserves and you look at some of the rural poverty. You go to downtown London. You go, okay. And then we can bring it back right back here to Elmer. Justin Trudeau is not making policies that are going to either fully eradicate or make more poverty in Elmer.
Right.
So now we got to go down lower, and I think this is where I think the political system is actually set up well, but exactly what we said, we focus so much on federal. And then there's provincial, but I actually want to jump past that for a second, because we can come back to provincial, because clearly, I mean, Doug Ford has made a ton of rules and enacted a bunch of stuff. So we got a liberal prime minister that we don't like and a conservative premier that we don't like, and so it's really, really hard. We're voting NDP next time, right? No, right? But then you go local and you go, okay, well, if we're actually going to start talking about some of these issues and actually helping people,
right?
The way our governing system is actually set up is local. So I'll give you an example, and I didn't know this, and maybe our listeners don't either, but when money comes in from the federal government, provincial government for social services, it goes in through St. Thomas.
Okay.
St. Thomas has then the ability to send it to the rest of Elgin, or just to keep it. And you begin to go, these local politics that none of us pay attention to, who runs for mayor, who does this stuff, there's very few people who are engaged, they have their budget meetings, people don't show up. But when you're actually on the ground, this isn't a liberal or conservative issue.
No.
Because what actually happens, a lot of this is rural. And now are our councils fighting for their share of the funding? Are our councils doing their job? Are the local municipal people doing their job to eradicate some of this stuff? But we always just talk about the upper echelon. Well, we just got to vote in a different president or prime minister. Well, so much of this is actually going to be, and so one of our biggest lessons we've talked about so often is we don't engage in local politics.
Right.
And right now during COVID, if we've never before realized why we should, this is a time where maybe we need to spend a little less time looking at federal and provincial and start going, okay, maybe when Malahide does their council elections or when Elmer does their council elections, we need to pay attention and actually think through who we vote, or maybe even let your name stand.
Right.
Because they're making a lot of decisions right now. They're having a lot of input that had a lot of effects. The way Elmer and Malahide handled COVID was significantly different than a lot of other regions. And it wasn't a Southwest Public Health thing.
Right.
It was up to them.
Yeah, and we noticed that. I mean, you noticed that with some of the sporting events that were allowed in the different regions.
Super frustrating.
And also, I noticed that as a parent going to parks. There was parks in other regions that were open, but parks around here were not.
Right.
You couldn't even sit down on a bench. And I mean, science and studies and research, be damned. It didn't matter.
Yeah.
Because of who was in charge and because of who was calling the shots, it did not matter what we already knew.
Right.
Because they were going to lead in a certain way, that's the decision that was made. Right or wrong, whatever. Obviously, you can tell my opinion on some of that subject, right? But that's the point of talking politics, and that's the point of talking about decision making and how you're going to engage moving forward.
Right.
And I think these things do matter. And I think I don't know if there will be, but I think there should be almost a tidal wave of involvement of people wanting to engage, of people wanting to make a difference in their communities on whatever level, whether it's getting engaged at the food bank or whether it's getting engaged in your local school board and being able to help make decisions that are going to help better the future of those that are here for all people. The one thing that we've talked about, we talked about a federal response to homelessness. It's not possible.
No.
It's not possible. But who's going to help resolve the situation in Elmer and Malahide of all the homeless people that are couch surfing? there might be 3 or 4 or 5 people at, the homeless shelter,
Right.
staying warm at night, but there are a lot more people that do not have a place to live that are sleeping in their cars.
Right.
There are people that are sleeping in couches and basements, and there are people that are still sleeping on the street.
Yep.
What are we doing for those people?
Right.
How are we responding to that? Those are questions that can't be answered federally. They have
Right.
to be answered by people who are engaged in their community and know these people, know who they are, and actually know how to help them and who they're connected to. That's a difficult thing.
Right, and there's a lot of pieces to that puzzle, and part of that is knowing the system.
Yeah.
And we read about this often in other countries, right? You talk about, throwing money at poverty doesn't eliminate poverty because humanity is so corrupt that so often the leaders that get this money end up corrupt and the money doesn't actually go to those who are impoverished. A lot of the same crap happens here. There isn't enough money to actually deal with all the poverty. And so he who speaks the loudest or he who speaks the first or advocates the most will get the most of the resources.
Or who has worked on having a relationship with who writes the check.
Well, yes. So much of it, though, is, okay, so if we're going to do something, we need to, I guess maybe where we're coming to is we need to quit trying to offload responsibility for our communities to everyone else.
Right.
If you want to make Elmer and Malahide better, you got to step up.
Yeah, it's
we
our
can't just say,
responsibility.
okay, well, in 4 years, when this election happens again, I'm going to vote conservative this time, or I'm going to vote liberal, or at the end of the day, so much of it is here. And what I have seen in Elmer and Malahide, and this is where we really work, but I think it's the same everywhere, is when you begin to advocate for those who cannot advocate for themselves, it's amazing what you get. My mom is an awesome example of this. And so she helps often with my aunt who is struggling with illness, and there's some language stuff. Well, when you send somebody who's already struggling with language to a doctor, the doctor can't do that much. And so because the doctors are often overworked and they're rushing through clients, but if you get somebody in there to advocate, it's unreal how much of a difference that makes. Do a little bit of a push, and I feel like it's the same thing with a lot of our issues. So when we talk about capitalism versus socialism, all those things are way above, and we have opinions on them.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, what Elmer and Malahide is going to be like is much more defined locally.
Yeah.
How much we're going to fight for our community, how much we're going to fight for those who are vulnerable, how much we're going to do for that. And what I think we got used to was disengaging and just saying, well, we got family and children's services, they'll deal with that stuff.
Yeah.
We got Southwest Public Health, they'll deal with that
We're
stuff.
paying
We got,
people to do this stuff, so we're good.
But then we don't engage.
Right.
So now we got politicians who are just as disengaged as we're just disengaged. And now you have, couple different leaders, one after another, who haven't advocated for the poor. And now all of a sudden you find out we're not getting any of the funding that's supposed to be coming to here. And there are a lot of people suffering because of it.
Yeah.
Whew, this was supposed to be like a 3-minute thing, but I'm glad we started with politics.
Well, I think it's much more nuanced than what we just want to focus on some big picture,
Right.
items and big picture problems, but the on the ground stuff. And you know what? In some ways, I feel for the people that get voted into these places because they're voted in essence, we're saying we want you to lead us on this.
Right.
And then we basically say, here you go, bye.
Right.
When the expectation is okay, I want to lead you on this. You wanted me to in here on this. I have expertise in this, but there's no backup.
Well,
and we can't fund it enough. As we have
Right.
seen, history has shown us already, you can't fund this stuff enough.
Right.
People have to get in on the volunteer level to make a difference. You can't just keep pouring endless resources because we don't have enough resources to pour into every single need. We just don't. You cannot tax people enough to be able to cover all the problems and brokennesses of humanity.
Yep.
We need actually humanity to step up to fill in those gaps so that we can, on a human level, human resource the solution together.
Yep.
That is the whole purpose and vision of community. I believe that's really, if we were to look at from a faith standpoint, the idea of church is you get a group of people together that are going to work towards a purpose and a cause of showing love and kindness and taking care of the people around them in a way that isn't just about throwing money at a problem, but also throwing humanity at the problem and being able to resolve it that way.
Well, and I know one of the things that we did to help us during this time of disagreeing with politicians was we got to know some of our politicians.
Yeah, and we have some.
I want to say locally, so I don't know all of our council, but I do know Scott Lewis is this guy who works on my cars all the time.
Yeah.
And we have talked to him, and I actually had the opportunity a while ago. We were talking about some ideas for Malahide, and he shared his heart as to why he ran.
That's awesome.
And when he shared that, and he goes, I just want to be a part of making this community better. and he talked about his time on the fair board, and he talked about how you begin to go, okay, I may disagree with the decision the Malahide Council made, but seeing that heart changes things. But I think, again, this is a shortcoming in our culture because we want to cancel everybody and we want to right away yell at them when we disagree. Well, what we miss then is the opportunity to actually hear the other person here. And now I go to council and I strongly disagreed with the way Malahide and Elmer handled COVID. But then I hear Scott and I kind of go, but I do know he was trying to do the best.
Yeah.
And that softens it. And then we picked up a bunch of food boxes with Dave Mennel.
We spent some time with Dave Mennel and like fantastic human being, awesome guy.
Well,
and that guy has spent, he's
how
like
many years?
30 to 40 years he's been doing Christmas care and taking care of community and advocating for people who don't have food and doing those. And if you actually understand the time and effort that gets put in on a yearly basis, not a paid position, but something that he's been doing. And I mean, it's fantastic, but to know the person's heart that he is actually doing something on the ground to make a difference, that matters to me.
Well, we had the opportunity to do that with Karen Vecchio and Jeff Urick as well. Not as much because they are very busy people, but the hour we got to spend with them early on in this pandemic really changed a lot for us.
Yep.
And especially my conversation with Karen because she really talked honestly and talked about some of her struggles with it. And it was such a rich conversation, but in the politics of it all, we somehow have to find a way to put our defenses down and go, okay, at the root of this, most people get into politics. There's some bad people in there, but most of them get into politics because they want to make Canada better. Mm-hmm. And when we begin to, we got 3 minutes, when we begin to dehumanize them and anybody who doesn't have our logo on their chest, and we just kind of trash them because they're liberal, we miss out on some really good ideas.
You know, it was interesting that you say this because I was just listening to somebody speak about a very liberal Democratic supporting guy. You know, they have him on all the left TV shows and all that kind of stuff. He's been chirped endlessly by the left because he advocated for his communities and what he does with a president that wasn't a Democratic president.
Right.
And he went and he fought for the people on the ground and he worked with that individual to try to make things better. And people hated the fact that he was willing to work with that individual. And his response is, what would you have me to do? My responsibility is to them to help take care of their needs.
Right.
And if I can work with that person to make that happen, why wouldn't I?
Right.
And I think sometimes we're like, well, I'm going to wait the 5 years till the next person's elected.
Yeah.
And then they'll take care of the problem because they're on my side.
Yeah.
No, you still need to advocate and get in there on the ground and say, no, I think I can find some common ground with you to help these people. Why make them wait 5 years? Because that might cost them their life.
Right.
So I think being able to get together with people and see their humanity, I believe most people, like you just said, that are involved in politics want to help.
Right. Well, and I think, so now going forward, I think if we're going to engage, we have to stop the social media engagement. And what I mean by that is stop using little slogans, but actually think deeply about some of the stuff. So what does my community actually need? What does this politician actually stand for? Yes, conservative and liberal, NDP, they have different belief systems. I got it. But each individual is still an individual.
Right.
Who are you voting for and why? And as it comes locally, get engaged. These guys on council, they do not make a killing. This is a lot of work for them. They face a lot of stuff. Get involved, get engaged, and be a part of the solution. And if not, then at least if people of faith, be praying for them, supporting.
Yeah.
And I think everyone, do your best to play your part to make community better. So we started by saying what lessons we're going to learn from COVID, and we figured out that politics matter, and there's a lot of discussion that needs to be happening. So we are running out of time.
Yes.
We will come back to this. Awesome. Thanks for joining us. See you soon.